So a big welcome and a brief acknowledgement of the country that I'm on as well. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Here in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri traditionally have occupied lands near the Yarra River or the Birrong, and it is a real beautiful place in this part of Australia to live and to work. And I'd like to just acknowledge their continuing connections to those lands, waters, languages, and cultures. So a real pleasure and a real honor to speak to you today about the science of learning and to give you a little bit of an insight into the book. This is coming out at the end of October. There's a lot of people who've been able to jump on and grab a copy as a pre-order. I've actually got a little quick link here for a super special that's being run by a local bookshop called The Brainery. They've got a super special at the moment, a sale to encourage local buying of this book, rather than giving all the money to Amazon. So if you want to support local businesses in Australia, this is also a really good deal at the moment. It's about, what is that? 12, 13, $13 off the original price, which is nice.
Yeah, so I'm going to be here in my jocks. Can I
there's
okay
one
with,
more.
I think.
How did that happen?
Oh,
Thank you. All right. So what is this book, The Harnessing the Science of Learning? It's essentially a contribution of many different people and an opportunity to work with a lot of cool players in the science of learning space. You'll recognize some of the names here from Australia and overseas. It's also a way of showcasing fantastic practice and fantastic examples of how to operationalize these principles in real life. And so I've got some amazing school stories and system stories that I share as part of the book as well. In terms of me and what I do, as Rup was saying, I'm from Think Forward Educators. I also work for La Trobe University as a senior lecturer, and I have a blog as well, which we talked about as well, which is a way to keep in contact with the teaching profession. So essentially, what the book is trying to achieve is really take what's quite a difficult topic and quite a complicated topic and make it much more accessible. What is the science of learning? Essentially, it summarizes existing cognitive science research on how students learn and connects it to practical implications for teaching. So it's not some sort of gimmicky buzzword, although it's always at risk of becoming a buzzword if we don't use it well. But the science of learning is essentially a body of knowledge that we can draw on, not dissimilar to the science of reading, but encompasses all kinds of learning in the classroom and in school. So not just reading and writing, but also mathematics and all the subject areas. And there are some really interesting things from the science of learning that help us understand how best to teach, many of which, if you've trained as a teacher in the past 20 to 30 years, you might not have actually encountered in your teacher education. Interestingly, there is a big change afoot in Australia, as we'll talk about in just a moment, where a lot of these findings are going to be taught at university, but it's not too late for you to get your head around it now that you're likely practicing in the field. I'm just going to open up the chat so I can see any questions that come through. Yep. So, Erin, you can pre-order from New Zealand as well if you just go through the Amazon link, which I can share with you as well. So, I think I've got a slide with an Amazon link too. But if you just Google that, the book title, Harnessing the Science of Learning, you'll be able to find that in a local bookstore or on one of the international bookstores as well. Good little hack. I should find a New Zealand bookstore who'd like to partner with me as well. It's a really good idea. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because I'm firmly of the belief, and I hold strongly to the evidence, that stories do change lives. And that although we've got all the evidence we would ever need in order to justify some of the teaching findings that I talk about in this volume, stories are what will help other people to connect with those findings and to make them real in their practice. So in many ways, Annie Murphy-Paul summarizes it very well as a cognitive science. And she says, our brains do not make much of a distinction between reading about an experience and encountering it in real life. In each case, the same neurological regions are stimulated. So it's a really insightful example of how stories actually can change the brain. And that's exactly what I've tried to do. So stories can change minds as a result. How can schools harness the science of learning? This is a question that I've been grappling with for the last at least 5 to 10 years. And one of the reasons why I founded Think Forward Educators, essentially, I think there are some fantastic ways that schools can start changing their practice right now that better reflect the findings that we have from the science of how we learn. And a lot of these things, as I said before, have not been taught very well in university education and are likely not very common practice, hence the need for a book like this. I'm actually more excited about this prospect and how much schools are looking to the science and to the evidence than ever before. And I've summarized that excitement in this little double volume that I'm going to share with you today. The idea that we are actually in what I'd like to call an Edu-Renaissance. But there are some wicked challenges ahead of us. I've said wicked rather than difficult because I think wicked things can be awesome as well, but they are still difficult and in some ways wicked challenges in the way that they're pervasive and quite hard to shift within our school systems. So Edu-Renaissance, let's jump into that first. What am I talking about? It's an Edu-Renaissance mainly because of the changes in practice. There's a resurgence in people being interested in teaching and being interested in instruction and how to be the best possible educators they can be. There's a renaissance in the way that policymakers are thinking about the supports for teachers and what's required for the teaching of teachers, for example. And there's a growing movement of people excited about education and excited about what the science of learning can do for their practice and for how we think about teaching. And I think that movement is sometimes critiqued for being too culty, if you like. But I think as long as we hold the evidence and the research close to our hearts, we can make sure that we don't forget that we are critically thinking consumers of information. And a movement does not have to be culty if we are really conscious of that. In terms of stories changing lives, I'm going to share with you a tiny extract from the book, which aims to showcase some really fantastic schools. This school, Churchill Primary, is remarkable. It's one of the first schools that I feature in the book, mainly because its story is so incredible. And I just want to share a few highlights for you today, from this particular story that I've been so lucky to share. Jackie Burrows is the principal at Churchill Primary, has overseen these changes with her assistant principals and literacy leaders. And it's actually quite awesome, I have to say. So I'm just going to let the story speak for itself. Churchill Primary is a 200-student public school situated 2 hours southwest of Melbourne in the Latrobe Valley. The school has typically served a strongly working-class student group. When current principal Jackie Burrows worked at Churchill as head of student wellbeing in 2016, she actually expected to use much of her day facilitating 5 or 6 restorative conversations with students who would spend more time in the corridor outside her office than in class. Not through lack of trying. Churchill had spent considerable energy implementing many approaches, including positive behavior support, and was actually considered a leading school in tiered intervention for behavior. Despite this, teachers needed to steel themselves daily for the seemingly inevitable kicking, punching, or swearing from 5 to 12-year-old students. In terms of previous practice, Churchill teachers had diligently implemented things like the Readers and Writers Workshop approach, benchmarking assessments using leveled readers and guided reading groups, which are all common practice in Australian schools and other English-speaking countries, such as New Zealand, under the banner of balanced literacy. Despite this, the staff were not seeing the gains in their reading outcomes they had hoped for, and were even placed on the local school's network list of schools at risk. Churchill's troubles were in both students' behaviour and learning, and students who had the most concerning behaviours were always nearly the most affected by literacy and numeracy difficulties. Jackie recalls a morning that was emblematic of the challenge that Churchill had at the time. She and a visiting psychologist were supporting a second-year teacher to organise her class of students for the second session of the day. Whilst the teacher repeatedly tried to refocus her group to the front of the room, one student began marching the full length of the classroom on his knees, thrilled with stealing every other student's attention. With 4 adults in the room, each were attempting to coax the students out from under tables, back onto the mat, and the crawling boy from his knees back to a seated position with the group. A thought struck the new principal, Jackie, at that moment. This is a bloody circus. Beginning in 2015 and 16, a series of chance events actually set Churchill into a completely different direction, one where the behavioural, academic, and intentional challenges plaguing the school would be systematically addressed and turned around. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in this story just so we can get to the meaty sort of stuff, but you can read the full thing in the volume. At one conference in Melbourne during an afternoon presentation, the presenter, Alison Clark, OAM, who's a Melbourne speech language pathologist and literacy expert, she runs the website called Spellphabet, you might have heard of. She asked the audience back in 2017 to raise their hands if anyone used running records or leveled readers. Jackie confidently raised her hand, this is the principal of Churchill, along with hundreds of others in the auditorium. Allison's next comment hit Jackie like a brick. Well, you shouldn't be. They don't align well with the reading science, and there is a much better way. Jackie was stunned, but skeptical. How could it be that none of her colleagues had heard of a different way to teach reading? The leadership team caught wind of a school in Melbourne's southeast where they were innovating their practice. Jackie would have loved to see for herself, but because of the behavioural incidents, her colleagues, Gail and Haley, attended a full day at Bentley West Primary in her stead. What they saw there was amazing. Jackie spent her day supporting some of the frequent flyers to her classroom, one of which was a boy called, I'm just trying to find where it is. I've lost his name. So just to tell you from memory, because I can't find this bit of the story for some reason, this is a boy who used to spend most of his class time at the top of the basketball ring rather than in class, because for him, there was no real point. He had such poor reading skills that there was no reason for him to actually try. So he used to voluntarily take himself to the office and sit outside Jackie's room until the reading block was over. And that's basically was a coping strategy that suited him very nicely. And despite the fact that he wasn't practicing or improving in his reading as a result. So when this leadership team went to Bentley West, they came back and raved about what they saw. They rang Jackie on the 2-hour drive back to Churchill, and it was incredible. You should have seen how engaged the students were. They don't do running records, and they don't even do guided reading. Jackie was puzzled. What do they actually do then? These events kicked off a steady but rapid transformation for Churchill Primary, which over 6 years has become one of the best examples around the country of instructional excellence aligning with the science of how we learn. In a process of discovery and experimentation, Churchill developed an overarching vision and plan for what their school could be. They overhauled their literacy teaching, trained their school in systematic synthetic phonics, and undertook many other changes to explicit reading and writing teaching across the school years. They engaged instructional experts like Associate Professor Lorraine Hammond, AM, to cement the shared definition of great teaching. They developed consistent rules, routines, clear expectations, and structures so that teachers could effectively model, guide, and facilitate student practice. The new Churchill was actually very different. Jackie says people can't actually recognize the school that it's become today. Government surveys into student perceptions show that kids are stimulated, engaged, and feeling successful, challenged, and supported. Despite still serving a highly disadvantaged community, the high level of school engagement is evident in the students' calm, respectful, and focused behavior. From a school at risk before this work, Churchill now leads the area, exceeding the expected performance of literacy and numeracy in grade 3 and 5, and outperforming similarly disadvantaged schools in several domains of the Standard National Test or NAPLAN. Several other schools in local Gippsland area around where Churchill is have been curious about Churchill's success and have begun adopting similar practices themselves. And before this change journey, Churchill did not really see the link between behavior and learning, but now it's very, very clear. The change to excellent teaching at Churchill improved not just the learning, but their very concept of success at school, closing the link between school motivation, behavior, and academic achievement. Students felt more confident as they experienced more success, and with the long-standing behavior systems in place, they were less likely to experience distress and behavioral issues. As for the wayward boy who used to skip reading sessions, Jason was his name in the story, he became one of the school champions for daily practice and review, and he could not have been more excited to finally learn to read and write. Having since moved to high school, Jason and Jackie keep in contact when they can. Even only having benefited from grade 5 onwards, Churchill's science of learning transformation meant that Jason has stayed in high school and stayed out of trouble. Deep down, Jackie knows that if he attended the new Churchill from beginning and end to end, this school could have changed Jason's life for good. So this is but one of the little nuggets and stories and insights into the school transformations that I'd like to share with you in this book, and that I'm hoping that you'll find useful, especially for your colleagues or for yourselves if you're feeling on the fence or skeptical about whether a change is necessary or whether it could actually help your school. Noting that many different schools have been featured, including Bentley West, who was mentioned, who come from very different backgrounds and have very different school populations. This was a school that was performing very well and was fine in terms of results, but has now become the top school in the state, if not the country, on many measures, because of their work in science of learning practice. There is a renaissance because of these schools, and I've aimed to capture those in the chapters of this book. But the Edu-Renaissance extends to the policy space and system level. There's Catholic Education Canberra Goulburn and Catholic Education Tasmania, which are all making moves in this space. Department of Education Victoria, the MAX, which is Melbourne Archdiocese, Tasmanian Government, New South Wales Government, South Australian Government, Queensland Government. The Aero group is fantastic and should be known about in New Zealand because the resources they make are really, really applicable to your setting as well. The Grattan Institute and the Centre for Independent Studies are all talking about very similar things and saying how important this practice and this change is. All the stars are beginning to align. The other areas are in teacher training. So there's a thing called the TEEP report, which said that all teachers will need to be trained in principles that align with the science of learning. And that's happening from next year onwards, is that process beginning. There's also a National School Reform Agreement, which is new in Australia as well, which says that professional learning should be aligned to these principles from the core content, which is coming in for universities. Along with that, the movement and the research undertaken at this time are huge as well. There is a plethora of fantastic organizations in Australia and internationally that are interested and are doing fantastic things in this space. Hence why I'm excited, and I think it does qualify as being a renaissance. You might be wondering, and your colleagues might be wondering, is this just a pendulum swing though? So there are many different aspects that you can add together to create a comprehensive picture of learning and education. And as has been prominent in the past 40 years, teachers today are used to hearing about things like the affective, the sociocultural, and the aesthetic aspects of learning. And they might be told that they're what we're forgetting as the forgotten pieces of the education puzzle. Ironically, this focus on the social, emotional, and well-being has actually neglected the cognitive aspects of learning in recent decades. I wouldn't say, though, that we're about to have a pendulum swing back to the cognitive. I would see this as an opportunity to really critique and to look at our practice carefully and see how we can meet all the needs of our students cognitively, social, emotionally, culturally, and linguistically, and otherwise. In many ways, some schools have seen this as an opportunity to get our profession back, as Yates Avenue principal David McSporran talks about. We can actually be really good at teaching and instructing and making good decisions in the classroom. This is one of the many offshoots and benefits of looking at things like the science of learning. So if I haven't convinced you, I encourage you to look at the book and see why I'm excited about the potential for an Edu-Renaissance. But now I want to talk to you about the challenges and how we actually get this vision to come to life. The second little chapter, if you like, that I'm going to go with into detail with you now, I've called Wicked Challenges. I'm going to look at a few of these, not all of these, in this little session. So in some ways, there are four main problems in how we spread and refine practices to align best with the science of learning. There's a teacher knowledge gap. There's problems with belief and the difficulty in enacting that knowledge and those beliefs. There's the curricular challenge and the huge amount of work it is to change our practice and change our resources, and the leadership and change challenges as well, including the challenges of implementation science. One of the big things that I've aimed to do in this book, and with my colleague, Dr. Zach Grishel, we've developed a very brief introduction to the science of learning, which helps illuminate four main ideas. The four main ideas are why learning is actually really hard, how knowledge can power that learning and overcome those difficulties with learning, how great teaching can facilitate student learning and make that learning process, which is difficult, a lot easier, and why learning is basically why we forget most of what we learn but don't have to. So forgetting is a part of learning, but it can be overcome. I'm going to look into just one of these ideas now to give you an insight into some of the things we're talking about in this book, and that's the idea that learning is actually really hard. One of the reasons learning is hard, and you'll find that a lot of our students don't retain and have difficulty mastering the things that we try to teach them, is because of the information processing model, which is an approach that helps to understand how learning can happen in the brain. And it's a simplified model from the studies that we have now. Sometimes this is referred to as a working memory bottleneck problem. So the environment that we seek to learn from is potentially infinite. There's no limit to things that we can learn from the world around us, the books that we read, the people we talk to. Our long-term memory as well is also potentially infinite. There's no known limits to long-term memory. If only we could get information from our environment to the long-term memory directly, that would be amazing. Learning would be simple. Unfortunately, there's two important buffers. The first one is attention. If we're not listening, not focusing, not attending, we can't actually learn from the experience that we're having. If only you could just attend and then learn, and that would be really easy as well, just listen and learn. Unfortunately, there's another buffer, and that buffer is called working memory. Working memory is notoriously limited and can only, unlike long-term memory, which is infinite, working memory can only hold a few items at a time. Ideally, when things are working well, it's not forgotten. Things just don't slip out and fall out of our working memory or a long-term memory. We actually remember them. And when we do remember them, we can bring things back from our long-term memory and use them to solve problems or to think about them in our working memory. So in some ways, this model leads into a further discussion about cognitive load theory, a big idea in the science of learning, which is now having its heyday. Something that is potentially revolutionary in how you think about learning and teaching, and what it might mean for your practice. Before we talk further about cognitive load theory and what I might want to teach you about that in this brief session, I want to do a brief knowledge check. Before I do that, I'm going to teach one more thing on this slide to ensure that we're on the same page. So just a reminder that the environment is infinite, long-term memory is infinite, but working memory is very limited. It's a little bit like the space that we're thinking in right now. So whenever you're hearing words from me, you're taking them into your working memory. If you're familiar with them, you might recognize things and use your long-term memory to hold those bits of information. If what I'm saying is more complicated and less familiar, more of that will be forgotten because working memory refreshes and deletes whatever was listened to or seen or thought about. It actually deletes it very quickly. With that in mind, I wonder if you can take on this CFU question to see if I've made myself clear. In the chat, I want you to answer A, B, C, or D when I say go. Don't do it until I say go. Working memory most resembles A, a toolbox with many different tools, B, a workspace that is constantly being cleared, C, a tape recorder you can play back any time, or D, a series of photographs you can look at over and over. I wonder if you can respond in the chat when I say go. Some people are quick off the mark, and you can go now. All right, I've got pretty synonymous B answers. I'm glad that I explained that quickly. Let's figure out why B is correct. Working memory most resembles a workspace that's constantly being cleared because you can use it, use what is there very briefly, but if you change tasks, it will be gone. It's not a toolbox because that's really long-term memory when you draw upon things that you already know and use those to skip steps or to see patterns. It's not a tape recorder because you can't play it back anytime. It's quite limited what you can play back. And it's not a series of photographs that you can look at over and over either. And that's not really long-term memory either, unless you've got what some people call a photographic memory, which is dubious whether that exists truly in the true sense of it, to remember every single thing that you see, for example. So that's one of the reasons this problem with memory and this problem with learning is one of the reasons why learning is actually really hard. When we're trying to get our students' attention, there's a lot of things that are getting in the way of that attention. When we're trying to break things down so that it's manageable in the working memory, it's actually really hard to do that. The only thing that overcomes that limited working memory is adding more things into our students' long-term memory. So giving them more tools in the toolkit that they can use to see the patterns and to see the things that we're looking at. So this teacher knowledge gap around the science of learning extends not only to that first principle about why learning is hard and what cognitive load theory is, but how knowledge is actually not something to be scared of, as opposed to some people who say that you can just Google anything, so you don't need to learn knowledge, you can just learn skills. Knowledge, actually, to give a bit of a wake-up call to the teaching professions around the world, is actually what we need in order to build our long-term memory and to approach tasks differently. And there's two different kinds of knowledge. So the types of knowledge can be broken down into biologically primary, which is basic, universally acquired information. You get it from acculturation and interaction, and is a real strong precursor to academic learning. This is contrasted with biologically secondary knowledge, which is not learnt naturally. It's acquired through deliberate instruction and explicit learning. You can discover it, but it is much harder and much slower and less reliable. This distinction is really, really key. And I'm going to demonstrate that as to how we can overcome working memory limitations by teaching things explicitly, and especially when it's biologically secondary knowledge. In the chat, I wonder if you can help me to think of what are some things that are biologically primary. I'll give you a hint for one thing. Well, navigating your local area, so being dropped in a spot and trying to find your way around without a map or without any help, is actually biologically primary. We figure out where doors and exits are, mainly for evolutionary reasons, I think. There's some other things like speaking And listening. Yet Doreen's had the idea, and so has Amy. These things we've been biologically primed to do it. Another thing might be facial expressions. Who can help me with things that might be biologically secondary, then things that are not naturally acquired that we need to be explicitly taught? Kylie, hi Kylie, how you going? Good to see you here. Kylie's written writing. Samantha's said reading. Andrew Ware, I love lots of familiar names here. Andrew has said writing. Louise Brown, another name I know, said reading. Excellent. Mathematics also counts there as well, but anything from the academic disciplines, complex scientific concepts, difficult ideas and concepts from literature and history and civics. Those things are not naturally acquired and actually quite difficult to learn, need to be taught explicitly. Excellent. And Erin's saying that math is its own language, which is very true. It's something that's very specific in how you use it. So biologically, secondary knowledge, which is the knowledge that can help us overcome working memory limitations and become better and more independent learners, it should be taught explicitly for the following reasons. I've got a little presentation to show you. Working memory is, as we know, overloaded by novel information. So we might hold it in our brain briefly, but then it's actually forgotten. New learning needs to be organized so it can reduce cognitive load. And that is best done but when we can learn from others. So we've evolved to learn directly from people via borrowing and organizing, and learners can generate information by themselves using trial and error. But borrowing and organizing, so stealing someone else's idea, is infinitely faster and more reliable. And that's essentially what we do as a teacher, is give them the shortcut and the toolkit and the information they need in order to solve the problem themselves. Once information is there in long-term memory, then the limitations of working memory can disappear. So we can bring information back into working memory at any time and use that to solve the problem and not get overwhelmed by all the extraneous parts. Therefore, such knowledge should be taught explicitly to build up our long-term memory to solve new problems in the future. And this is what makes the difference between novices and experts in a given domain. I don't have time right now to go into too much detail, but just to give you a little preview of some of the problematic or pervasive ideas that are also a barrier, which I actually tackle in chapter 5, I want to look at just 2 of these. And one is number 2 here, is the idea of being a guide on the side or risk interfering with learning. This is a misconception, just like all 4 of these misconceptions, which is really, really prominent, which the science of learning helps to resolve. So one of the reasons it's resolved by this idea is because novices and experts actually learn in different ways. And if you're a guide on the side with novices, then you're really throwing them in the deep end. Some of them will intellectually not make it. Others will potentially learn eventually, but actually in a much more inefficient way. So novices benefit from clear explanations, step-by-step instructions, and worked examples. They struggle with problem solving in that domain. Experts, on the other hand, can work without explicit guidance, relying on some stored knowledge for problem solving. And it's the knowledge of the domain which sets novices and experts apart. So experts are experts because they actually know a lot about the problem, the task, the body of knowledge, the way of speaking, the mathematical thinking, all of those things they're actually expert in because of the knowledge in their long-term memory. So back to these problematic ideas, we can resolve this one around knowledge being unimportant for the 21st century, and the idea of being a guide on the side being a great idea, which obviously, if you look at the science, you realize that it's not. We need to actually sometimes be more of a sage on the stage, but less lecturing and more interacting and giving adequate practice and instruction, because novice learners really need us to do that in order to make learning much more possible. You might have some visceral reactions, though, to some of these ideas, and we address these in chapter 13 as it happens. Some teachers might say, well, that doesn't look like learning to me when the teacher's directly teaching. And it might be something like death by PowerPoint. You might have heard this idea that if we're constantly just teaching from resources on PowerPoint or sheets, for example, that we're going to just make learning boring. And I'm here to tell you that, and the book certainly looks at this in detail, that however we structure it with PowerPoint or otherwise, explicit and direct teaching that helps give students adequate practice is what can overcome the limitations of working memory, not free range sort of exploration, which is actually much more popular at this point. So back to our wicked challenges as a way of rounding out this discussion and opening up the questions from you. There is more things that I think are in the way of this, and part of that is the beliefs and the enactment. So we actually need to invest in professional practice, coaching, and assessment in order to help our teachers, our colleagues, and our students to adjust to a different way of teaching and learning, one that does take into account the insights from the science of learning. There's a big curricular challenge. We need to actually think differently about our materials and how we're using them, and teach in a slightly different way, which means that a lot of our curriculum resources need to be updated. And that's a big job. One of the benefits of this current era is that there are many organizations willing to share resources with you. I know that I try and make a lot of things available for free on my website, including some resources for the teaching of reading and writing. But there are also great organizations like Ochre Education, which is an Australian group that make a lot of information and resources free as well. So the review materials in maths and English, and many more things that are coming, including science lessons and mathematics full lessons as well. And like my last little point here is around the leadership challenge. There's actually a really important role for leaders in order to do their work really well. So leaders need to make this change as easy as possible. And part of that, as I talk about in one of the chapters with Bentley West ex-principal Stephen Capp, who I'm going to visit tomorrow morning, as it happens, we talk about the need for principals to protect the attention of the teachers and students. So to make the learning and the change process possible in schools that you might be working in or working with, the principal and the leadership need to help improve the environment in which they're trying to make that change. So part of that is looking at providing time, space, and resources so that teachers can plan that new learning and understand, get their head around how best to break learning down into manageable chunks and think about their curriculum really differently. And then have the instructional practices and routines and support structures around them to enact the teaching as best as possible. Teaching explicitly, teaching in a whole class environment more of the time. This is a really different way of teaching, and it's a really different way of using your skills as an instructor. And so investing in time to help your teachers make that shift is really important. Simultaneously, leaders should also be reshaping school structures that help to build the space for change. And this is doing things like having really solid professional learning and professional knowledge building, investing in coaching and good assessment practices, and additional supports like multi-tiered systems of support for behavior and for academic skills, so that teachers can get to the work of teaching and not be weighed down by really complicated school-wide issues. The other thing that principals need to do is to protect and promote the work. Cut down on the extras and focus on the essentials, especially when you're doing massive, massive changes. This is something that we have to learn the hard way sometimes as leaders and as teachers, is that we can bite off more than we can chew, and we can try and do too much at once, and then everything can end up being quite mediocre. So sometimes going a bit slower on other fronts can make space to go faster on the main front, which should be the improving of teaching and learning, in my opinion. So they're the wicked challenges that we have. I hope that this has given you some insight into some of the interesting insights from the science of learning, but also the challenges ahead in order to enact them. And that's essentially what the book has tried to do. We are in an Edu-Renaissance, but we also have some challenges ahead. And here are some very small caveats that I want to share with you, just in case you're not sure. So the body of work referred to as the science of reading, as I'm quoting from Louisa Moats, is not an ideology. It's not a philosophy or a political agenda or a one-size-fits-all approach. It's a body of knowledge, an emerging consensus from many related disciplines based on literally thousands of research studies. I also think that one of the caveats is to put down the appeals to nuance, which are a common refrain when people talk about big ideas in education. They'll say, well, every child learns differently, or it's more complicated than that, or things will be different depending on the situation, and each school has its own unique context. I think it's time for us to see what are the commonalities in our teaching and learning experiences across many settings and with many children, and realize that we have much more in common as teachers and learners than we have separate. It's also about investing in the best bets. So although we don't know the complete picture of every school and every student, we have some very good ideas about how learning happens and how best to teach, and they're ready to use right now, which is something really exciting. If you are on this journey yourself and you're thinking about what are your next steps, one of my tips to you is to try and be unafraid of trying and failing. We can sometimes get weighed down by the risk that we might make a mistake or that we might not get things exactly right to begin with. And I think part of your work as facilitators and instructors of learning is to be okay with making mistakes, just like we want students to be okay with making mistakes in their learning. I also want you to think about being diligent, but being open to admitting the need to reshift. You want to try your best to do everything you can to get things right, but you actually have to be open to the idea that you might have made a mistake and you need to reshift things. And that's okay. That's part of the learning process for us as learners ourselves, but also as educators. Finally, a little thank you and a little call out to these amazing schools that have given up their time working with me to capture some of their stories and share them with an audience like you and an audience reading the book. And I do hope that you will stay in touch. There's an opportunity to get in touch with me anytime. I've got a QR code that links to my website where you can jump onto the newsletter and get onto the weekly blog. And finally, if you're interested now in having a look at this book and what it might offer you in your practice, I'm hoping that it has sparked your interest. It's going to be here in time for Christmas, which is exciting, end of October. It's the perfect book to throw on your principal or your school leader's desk and say, I think we should have a look at this. Anyone can pick this up and have a look and have a decent introduction to some of the big ideas from the science of learning and hopefully catch the bug and get excited about the potential for change in their school. And with that, I want to say a big thank you for having me. Thank you, Rupert, for organizing tonight. And thanks, everyone, for your questions, which we'll now address for the remainder of the session.
Thank you so much, Nate. That was such a fascinating presentation. I was writing notes down because I was sort of just learning, just such a crystal clear way of understanding cognitive load theory, which, it's a transformative discovery of my, during my time as a teacher, and having it explained like that, I think was just so clarifying. So it's, it's just interesting to think about that as a human who's still learning. What I really took away from your discussion in particular was the moving away from that false dichotomy between the cognitive aspect of education and the other, three aspects of education you spoke about there. And actually what we're doing is returning a really important arrow to the quiver of education as a whole. We're not actually taking away from other things. We are adding to it. It's an additive process of strengthening, the sort of rope of education. So thank you so
definitely.
much. It was really, really fascinating. And of course, such an important, something I'm so passionate about is that primacy of knowledge in terms of building learners from novice to experts, building that long-term memory, and bringing knowledge back in. I was one of the, I guess, instructional casualties of the initial teacher education, where we were doing 21st century skills, and we thought we could reduce education down to three different skills, and essentially that was all you needed now. And how wrongheaded that was. So it's great.
Well, it's so appealing, that idea, though, isn't it, Rupert? I'm happy to unpack that a bit further because I know it was brief, but we ideally you think, oh yeah, there's a plethora of information. You don't need to have memorized it. You can just think critically, creatively, and collaboratively, and suddenly you've got everything you need. Unfortunately, the science of learning does reveal that those skills, critical thinking, creative thinking, collaboration, all the C's, are actually built on very strong bodies of knowledge. And if you haven't got that knowledge down pat, you're not even going to know what to Google in order to compensate for your lack of long-term memory bedded down. I'm happy to answer questions though from the chat, though it seems like it's really taking off in some respects.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll also, just because it's being recorded, so if people are just when you get a chance, do something the newsletter and you get the video so you can share this in your professional learning. I think there's a bunch of principals here and who might want to share this sort of more broadly in their schools. I think it's such a great discussion. So let's have a look. Questions. I think a lot of thankses, which is great. Here we go. A question I find difficult. This is from Doreen. So a question I find difficult to answer is when other teachers argue that everyone has different learning styles, learn different ways, etc. Advice on how to begin answering. I think that's a really important question. I'm sure one that a lot of resonates with a lot of people. So do you want to handle that one, Nate?
Definitely. Look, the learning styles has been around, but it's been debunked for the last 30 years or so. So around the 90s, they basically found that there is no evidence to support teaching according to a different preference or style. Yes, we might experience the feeling that we prefer to have visuals or prefer to have auditory information or prefer to do things hands-on, but actually the evidence doesn't show that the teacher making decisions with their instruction, which chooses one mode for particular people with that preference, essentially has no result. So the way to remember it, and I think the best way to go about this change, Doreen, is that the subject itself, the content that you're teaching, is what we should use to best dictate how the learning should happen. So if you're reading a book and you're reading a novel together, it might be good if the students have a copy of that so they can read along with the teacher as they're reading aloud rather than just listening the whole time, because then they've got the visual information matching at the same time as the verbal information from the teacher and they can look back and refer. If you're learning music, ideally you're going to grab some instruments and to tactily play with those instruments and to hear and to auditorily do them. You're not going to do music without the music on, if that makes sense. If you're doing science experiments and part of the learning that you're doing is knowing how to handle materials, you're going to do some hands-on materials. But ideally, you've also learned some scientific knowledge as well, which you've learned verbally and potentially in a written format too. So the subject itself should lend itself to the learning. And it's not a matter of offering a different range of styles for different learners, because essentially everyone benefits from clear, concise instructions and access to the information in very similar ways.
Thank you, Nate, and thank you, Doreen, for your question. There's a question up here. It's from Erin. It's sort of less of a question, more of a challenge, which I think is an important one. It's I'm a Kiwi, but in middle management, so can only influence so much. And I think it's such an important challenge that a lot of people face when they're not necessarily the principal class and they're trying to affect change in their schools. So I suppose, do you have advice, Nate, around how schools have brought people along, and maybe how people who are doing this work kind of, and trying to affect change, but maybe not at the principal level, can sort of go about doing that? And what have you seen, I guess, in your travels?
So in a lot of the stories, the middle leaders have played a really big role in changing their school approaches and transformation. So in some cases it's been principal led, in others it's been a groundswell from the classroom teacher, but middle leaders have often played a starring role in those transformations in the case studies that I've come across and the ones that I've written up in the book as well. And so essentially I think that part of what you need to do is to try and find the pathways to understand what your principal wants for the school, understand what their vision is for the school, and use whatever information you have available to you, whether it's assessment data, whether it's behavioral observations, whether it's examples at schools in the local area that you could point to, whether it's stories like the ones that we're sharing tonight, which say, well, we're a school like this one here in chapter 2. Can you read this chapter for me and just tell me what you think and see how they were doing it? That's, I think, those examples of, there actually is a different way of doing things and this school has done it, and I just want you to give me a go. That those things can really help to break the ice of that might, and the barriers that might be there from the principal class, if you like. So I think it's finding those motivations, seeing what arguments would actually stick and would land. And we're finding that more and more systems and schools are successfully getting things across the line in a way that means that change is going to be open and done. If you've got the green light to do a trial, for example, choose something that you're going to get quick wins for. Choose something you're going to see results. So choose things like daily review or retrieval practice that allows you to show quick improvement in things like retention of previous learning. Do things like an intervention program for your lowest readers based on an evidence-based, research-based program, and show how you can reduce the number of lower progress readers if you're in a high school, for example, or an upper primary. So choose those quick wins, find them and celebrate them, and then try and bring in your principal into those conversations and help them to see the world the way that you're seeing them.
Great, thank you, Nate. A question here from a name I recognize, Amy, a former colleague of mine from Store Secondary College teaching days. Great to see you, Amy. Thanks for being
Amy.
here. So Amy's asked, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on how a school might set up an effective PLC structure to introduce and incorporate science of learning principles across the school. What might the ideal plan for implementing this look like from a professional learning viewpoint? And it might be helpful just to sort of unpack what a PLC is, just if
sure.
New Zealand
for the New Zealand context. Yeah. So PLCs are very commonly used in Victorian schools. It's been a big investment of the government system into that structure. It's the idea that teachers don't just receive PL and sort of hope for the best, but they actually analyze data, implement things in action cycles and reflect. My one critique of PLC structures are that they're pretty content agnostic. So you can put some data that doesn't necessarily have a good evidence base or reliability behind it, and then analyze that data, which might not have that much relevance to reality, just to be harsh. And you might also be looking at instructional practices that don't have a lot of evidence. The key thing, I think, to get this kind of PL to work is to bring in the expertise of schools that have also done this really successfully and can walk the walk as well as talk the talk, as well as access some of the really high quality free and or moderately priced professional learning that's out there in order to build the knowledge base of your teachers. I think the reading side of the PLC cycle is something that's missing quite a bit, as well as the PD that you need to access from external resources, whether they're in textbooks, webinars, or other presenters that you come in. Essentially, if teachers can't really see what you're talking about, they potentially will dismiss some of the ideas that align with the science of learning as, oh yeah, I used to do that, or I already do that, so I don't really need to change anything. I think follow up those big PDs or big sort of webinars and things like that with those PLC conversations where you're working as a team to see how you're going to implement it. But don't be afraid to get in help to see whether if you're doing it right. I think you need sometimes someone to come into your classroom and model the things that you're talking about, such as checking for understanding or more active teaching opportunities. In order to believe that it's possible. You might have quite a difficult class where it's difficult to introduce new practices, but having someone in there that can show and demonstrate some of these things might actually be the change impetus that you need.
Thanks. Thank you. So a question here from Eric. When you shared Jackie's story with us, you mentioned that she was shocked to learn that the school her colleagues visited did not do running records or benchmark assessments. Can you elaborate on this a bit more? Do they not do these assessments at all, or did they just change the way they did these assessments? Thank you.
Great question, Eric. So benchmark assessments and running records, unfortunately, have not stood the test of time in terms of the evidence base. So there are some different kinds of assessments that do gauge where students are at with their reading and spelling skills that are a lot more reliable and that can give you much more concrete data. So things like they're called CBM measures or curriculum-based measurements, which look at things like reading fluency, passage reading fluency, word reading, and sound letter identification. Usually they're 1 or 2 minute tests. One of the very popular ones are Dibbles or Acadience, and I'm happy to share those in the chat if you're interested. But these assessments are a lot more reliable. They're actually a lot quicker to implement as well. Some of the problems with benchmarking and leveled reader sort of based assessments is that they're sometimes as reliable as 50%, which is basically the same as flipping a coin to figure out which level the student is on. So yes, there are other assessments out there, and some schools are finding them that they give them much better information about which students might need additional support much earlier rather than a traditional sort of wait to fail approach.
Thanks, Nate. What can you just elaborate on the wait to fail approach?
So it's a bit of a harsh term, but some parents with dyslexia have come up with that idea mainly because they've been told by their teachers, not for want of trying, that potentially some students will just grow out of early difficulties that they have. So it's the belief that if we just don't intervene and wait a bit longer, that some students will just close the gaps themselves just by catching up. And some students, every child learns differently is a common phrase. Apparently a lot of people have given that advice to parents over the years that and probably told themselves that, oh, if they don't get it in year 1, they'll probably get it in year 2. So wait to fail is a harsh term, which essentially means we're going to push the problem down the line so that the prep or foundation, or I've forgotten what the term is in New Zealand. Rupert, help me out here.
Oh,
first year of school is called.
I'm a bad expat. Can someone put in the chat the first year? I think it's just foundation or year 1. I think in New Zealand.
Was it year 0? I have a feeling it might be even year 0.
My son just started. I don't know the name. I'm so sorry.
Rip's not paying attention.
New entrant. Yeah, I'm a terrible Kiwi. I'm sorry, everybody. New entrant. That's right.
New entrant. So you might say, oh, the new entrant teacher won't worry about it. We'll wait until year 1 for them to start worrying about any literacy difficulties. In some ways, you could do a lot more in that first year of school if you are vigilant, if you pick up those early difficulties and provide additional light touch but small group intervention, for example, that catches them up. And I know that there's a lot of movements in the New Zealand context in order to embed more structured literacy approaches that align with the science of learning and reading. And part of that is going to be more assessment systems that help to identify readers who need that additional support much earlier.
Great, thanks, Nathan. I can see some people drop Dibbles and Little Learners as some other resources out there, but yeah, Dibbles is definitely a popular one. Aaron's asked, how do we do intervention without streaming?
Mm-hmm. So intervention without streaming is easy. So intervention should really be done through an MTSS approach, so multi-tiered system. intervention. This is when tier one instruction is whole class. It's everyone gets the same opportunity to access the grade level curriculum, and tier two is additional to that. So not instead of, they do additional reading and spelling or mathematics intervention in order to catch them up or to help them get ahead, if you like. So tier two is not instead of, so it's not an example of streaming. Tier three intervention, which is individualized or highly specialized intervention, is also in addition to tier three. So it's tier one and two and three if you're getting the top tier of intervention. So important to remember that it's not streaming because everyone still gets access to that quality instruction, which allows them to experience that grade level content even when they're still consolidating.
Right. Thank you. A question from Lauren. I'm guessing the families connected to the schools you include in your book are thrilled about the science of learning. Is this the case?
So it's interesting. I think many parents, if they haven't seen the alternative, will send their child to a school that is adopting and using practices that align really well with the science of learning and not really know that how lucky they are. Other parents that have moved schools or that have seen their school transform and maybe have one child who was there before that change and another child who's younger who's experienced post that change, they are certainly seeing the difference. One of I think the testaments of this approach is that school still looks like school to a lot of parents. And if their child didn't have difficulty, one of the biggest things I might notice is that kids are coming home talking about what they're learning and have a much more explicit awareness of all the cool facts and cool ideas that they've learned about. If their child has a difficulty, they might notice that they don't have that difficulty anymore and they can read and write and can spell and potentially do a lot more maths than they used to be able to do. So I think it's a mixed bag in some ways because sometimes parents are pretty oblivious to just how lucky they are to send themselves into one of these schools.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so a question here. What do you think about OTJs, observable teacher judgments? I'm not familiar with that term.
I'm just going to remind myself what OTJs are. I've heard that term before. I don't know if it's New Zealand specific. OTJ. Observable teacher judgments. And this is about reading, I'm guessing. This is a term that's more common in the NZ, I think, in Aotearoa. Let's see. This is something that's used on one of these Ministry of Education websites. Tool outcomes. Overall, so not observable, overall teacher judgments, OTJ. So it's putting together the information from assessment, so standardized assessments, the conversations with students and with families, as well as observations of what students are doing. I think in terms of that principle of using multiple sources of information, I sometimes call this OTJ concept potentially triangulation. So you're using multiple sources and trying to triangulate towards the closest resemblance of what might be going on in terms of progress or in terms of attainment. It sounds like a fine principle for me. What I want to make sure is that the tools that you're using to get that objective data, as well as the subjective data you'd get from observation and from conversations, making sure those tools are as reliable and valid as possible. Sometimes we're measuring things that potentially don't exist, and some like a level sort of thing that's an arbitrary level, and sometimes we're using an assessment that doesn't reliably get the same result with the same student on a different day or with a different assessor. So it's too much reliant on the assessor to administer it the right way.
Okay, great. Thank you. A comment from Andrew regarding just the irony of the charge of science of learning being an ideology, which is often coming from an ideological standpoint. I suppose maybe, Nate, if you have any advice, practical advice for how do you engage in those conversations and try to move things away from the kind of heated, it can often get quite heated, right? And it can be quite a sort of, almost like a cultural war issue sometimes. How do you, do you have advice? Have you seen how people have, have people told you about how they've actually brought along that colleague who was not on board at all and maybe actually, I don't know, changed their mind or just has cooled their heads a bit and sort of let's have a conversation about what's best for our kids and our students?
I think for the past 20 years, people have tried to solve those heated discussions by throwing the book at the opponent and saying, well, here's the evidence. But we've had this term evidence-based practice banging around a lot in Australia, and I'm guessing in New Zealand as well. And that hasn't always meant the same things. The term science of learning is more useful, I think, than evidence-based practice, because evidence-based practice can mean a whole lot of different things. Mind you, saying that something is research-based at the moment doesn't really cut it. I don't think it really stops people who do see this as a bit of a threat to their view of education, or who don't like the view of education that's being promoted that aligns with the science of learning. I know there's research happening right now in Australia by people interested in the problems with ideologies influencing education, who are saying that the science of learning is as a form of ideology, and it's affecting people's practice. I would say that it's not an ideology because the practices that we're talking about are going to be continually updated. If more research comes out and it shows that it's actually not effective to check for student understanding constantly, and we should probably do it less often, then my view as an evidence-based, science-informed practitioner would be to change my advice. I think the difference between that and adopting a position that doesn't necessarily come from a scientific sort of based body of knowledge, the difference between the science-based version and the more, this is my philosophy of how schooling should work, is that the philosophies don't usually have to justify themselves in terms of evidence. They don't have to test those theories. Whereas science is all about testing theories. And it's the view that all theories are bad and wrong, but some theories are quite useful. So there's no theory that fully explains everything in reality, but there's some theories that, like cognitive load theory, for example, that does explain quite a lot and is quite useful. And it's not a matter of absolutes. What we're talking here is a matter of probabilities. And the probability is that more students will benefit, more students will have a more well-rounded education, will have more opportunities to close equity gaps when we use approaches that have the best evidence. And I think that process is constantly changing of what that evidence will be, and also which practices will be most indicated from that evidence. So my answer to ideology questions are read up on the evidence, because the evidence is very strong, but also use your own observation skills. Go and see the schools that are using these practices and see the difference between their previous practice and now. There's not many schools that I know of that have adopted strong philosophies that conflict with the science, who can say, here's a school that has made this change and look at how amazing it is. Or here's the NAPLAN data or the standardized testing data that shows this change. I think they're probably resting on arguments rather than evidence in order to push a view that is contrary to some of the ideas and principles that I'm sharing tonight.
Thanks, Nate. We have reached time. We've got 2 more questions. Do you have time to answer these last 2 here?
But of course, and if anyone needs to jump off, not a problem.
So from Lauren, would you recommend teachers picking up some postgrad quals in the science of learning as they embark on instigating change?
I think there are more and more courses available that can do this work. There's also just a fantastic set of incredible resources and textbooks that you can read for your own enjoyment, but also for your own learning. And a lot of my learning has come from work within schools and work at high performing schools, but also a lot of independent reading of the research and of summaries of the research from some of these fantastic authors. I have got a little slide here that talks about some examples of this research, I believe, if I can find it. And if not, in the book, I've got a pretty extensive reading list that links you to lots of other places where you can get some really cool knowledge. So in lieu of that, I'm just going to defer to the book again, if that's okay, because I don't have that list in front of me. But one of them that springs to mind is the work of Stanislas Dehaene, who is a cognitive scientist. I'm going to just put this Stanislas Dehaene, who is a cognitive scientist who has gotten some really fantastic books on the science of reading and learning, and mathematics as well, which is another topic that we tackle in the book too on our science of math chapter. As well as the work of Paul Kirshner, who has written some very accessible books, including How Learning Happens, which is really, really, really easy to grapple with and really research-based. So an opportunity to delve into these ideas. There's also, if you're interested, at risk of spruiking too many things tonight, I have got a short course that is 4 weeks long, but I'm looking to probably make it into 5 weeks long, just to make it a bit more manageable for people, because I did jam a lot of content in there. There is a short course at La Trobe University that I've developed about the science of learning that uses all the things that I know, and tries to put them into manageable sort of recommendations and readings and resources for teachers. So applicable for primary and secondary, and will run again next year if you want to put an inquiry in to get onto that mailing list. The other place, though, to access free professional learning is Think Forward Educators, which I've linked to, but also my blog. I sort of share weekly summaries and ideas on my blog every single week. And if you want the QR code for that one, was this one here, if you want to jump on that one and sort of get access to that information as soon as it comes out. I've also got past presentations in subscriber downloads, free downloads, not paid or anything like that you can look at all my previous talks that I've done, and any readings that are on there as well if you want to jump into it.
Fabulous. You're like the Mary Poppins of the science of learning. You just keep pulling things out
There's
of your
more
bag.
things coming out. And look, hence why it's a renaissance. There is more and more and more fantastic books coming out. My colleague, Zach Rochelle, who I wrote one of the chapters with, he's got a new book coming out on explicit teaching called Just Tell Them. And it's going to be a fantastic book all about how to be an explicit instructor and to be really on top of your craft. There's also the work of people like Peps McRae and Craig Barton in the UK, who are doing amazing things in the teaching of mathematics and general instruction. And I'm really excited to keep learning from people like that, to keep reading their books and listening to those podcasts. Thank you, Vanessa, for plugging Think Forward Educators and recommending it to people. I'm really glad it's been helpful for so many people here in Australia, but potentially overseas as well. I know we have quite a few New Zealand members in Think Forward too.
Excellent. Okay, last question is from Lisa, and we'll wrap it up there. How would you explain to a parent the difference between the science of reading and the science of learning? Thank you, Lisa.
Very, very easy answer there. The science of reading is a body of knowledge about how children learn how to read and spell, and it's a subset of the science of learning. So the science of learning includes the science of reading, because the science of learning includes learning in general, but also the learning of mathematics, the learning of reading and writing, the learning of curriculum, the learning of social emotional skills. All forms of learning are encompassed under that umbrella. And it's a huge body of knowledge, but there are some really great insights that we can use in our practice right now, hence the reason for writing this little book.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Nate. Thank you for taking time this evening. Thank you to everyone who's attended, such a concentrated burst of knowledge and expertise.
Hopefully not too much knowledge. There's always at risk of cognitive overload, unfortunately.
Sure, yeah, no, that's great. So I'm sure our working memories are pumping away furiously trying to process all that. That was fabulous. Do jump onto those various links Nate shared, and pre-order the book. It's going to be, I think, a really amazing read. So thank you everyone again, and take care. Look out for the next talk coming up with the speaker series in the next couple of months. And yes, have a great evening and a great rest of your week, everybody.
And check out Spellcaster as well, which
is give it a go.
I'm excited to have a look at it myself. So it's come a long way since we last spoke, Rupert. So I'm really excited to have a look.
Thank you. That means a lot. Yes, please do check it out. Reach out if you have any questions. I'm all ears and ready to answer any questions too. Thank you so much, Nate.
Thank you.
All right.